seat. There comes a point in every connection where you've given all that you can give. You've shown up, you've cared deeply, you've been patient, and yet somehow it's never enough to shift the other person into showing up with the same level of energy. That's the point where most people feel powerless. But what's fascinating is that the real power begins not when you try harder to make them see your value, but when you stop trying altogether. When you stop caring in the way that drains you. When your sense of peace no longer depends on their attention. You enter a completely different psychological space. Emotional detachment isn't about becoming cold or indifferent. It's not about pretending you don't care or playing games to manipulate their reaction. It's about realizing that caring should never come at the cost of your self-worth. It's about understanding that your emotions are yours to protect, not theirs to exploit. When you detach emotionally, what you're really doing is reclaiming your power. You're saying, if I no longer allow someone else's inconsistency to dictate my emotional weather, and that statement, even if unspoken, changes everything. See, when you care too much about how someone perceives you or whether they'll return your energy, you hand over the steering wheel of your emotional life. You start living reactively, waiting for a text, analyzing a tone, replaying conversations in your head. You lose presence in your own life because you're busy managing the idea of someone else. But when you withdraw that overinvestment, you come back to yourself. You start noticing the peace that comes when your focus shifts inward. You start realizing that your energy is precious and that not everyone deserves unrestricted access to it. And here's where it gets interesting. That shift doesn't go unnoticed. When a person who was used to your constant care, attention, and reassurance suddenly meets your calm detachment, it triggers something in them. Because people feel energy. They notice when your warmth becomes quiet, when your availability turns into boundaries. At first, they might be confused, even defensive, but eventually they begin to feel the loss, not because you punished them, but because they finally experienced what it's like to live without the attention they once took for granted. This is the paradox of human connection. The moment you stop chasing validation, the more valuable your energy becomes. Your emotional independence becomes magnetic. You're no longer trying to prove your worth. You're embodying it. And that presence, that peace, that quiet strength creates a kind of gravity that draws people in. It makes them reflect on what they lost and why they lost it. Because nothing makes someone realize your importance more than the silence that follows your absence. So, when you stop caring in the way that exhausts you, you don't lose power, you reclaim it. You don't lose love, you redefine it. You learn that the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to step back from what keeps you small and lean into what makes you whole. And when you do, you'll sit. The subtle shift, the regret, the realization in their eyes. But by then, you'll also see something even more powerful, that you no longer need their recognition to feel complete. When you stop caring in the way you used to, when your energy no longer bends to fit someone else's indifference, something profound begins to happen beneath the surface. You start to see the truth that was always there, but was hidden behind your effort. Because effort has a way of blurring reality. It convinces you that if you just give a little more, wait a little longer, or love a little harder, the outcome will change. But the truth is, genuine connection never requires you to lose yourself to prove your worth. When you finally let go of the emotional tug of war, what you're really doing is creating space for truth to reveal itself. The dynamic shifts, not because you're trying to make a point, but Because energy doesn't lie. People feel when they are no longer the center of your world, when your mind is no longer orbiting around their attention or approval. It unsettles them, especially if they've grown used to being prioritized without earning it. Suddenly, the balance of emotional power equalizes, and that's when regret begins to creep in. You see, most people don't realize what they have when it's constantly available. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort often breeds complacency. When you are always there, always caring, always forgiving, they subconsciously assumed that your presence was permanent, that no matter how distant they became, you would wait. But when you stop caring, you disrupt that pattern. You show, not through anger or words, but through peace and distance, that their access to you was never unconditional. And that realization has weight. It forces reflection. Now, here's the beautiful irony. Your withdrawal doesn't just affect them. It transforms you. Because when you stop trying to change how someone treats you, you start changing how you treat yourself. You stop making excuses for inconsistency. You stop settling for emotional crumbs when what you deserve is consistency and respect. You begin to realize that love should not be something you have to chase. It should be something that meets you halfway. That's where growth happens. That's where you reclaim emotional freedom. And from that space of clarity, something else emerges, attraction shifts. When you were overly invested, your energy came from need, whether it was the need for reassurance, connection, or closure. But when you step back, your energy begins to come from self-assurance. You become grounded, calm, mysterious even, because you no longer seek validation because you've already given it to yourself. That energy, confident, detached, peaceful, is magnetic. It pulls people in without you having to try. The irony is the same person who once took your attention for granted now begins to notice its absence like oxygen leaving the room. They start to replay old moments, analyze your silence, and wonder what changed. But what changed wasn't them. It was you. You stopped performing for their affection. You started living from your truth. And that, more than any emotional strategy, is what makes someone wake up. The moment you stop trying to convince someone to see your value, they begin to see it on their own. Not because you manipulated them, but because you finally gave them the gift of missing you, the space to realize the difference between being adored and being ignored. So, stop chasing explanations. Stop trying to earn what should be freely given. The day you stop caring is not the end of something. It's the beginning of everything real. Because when you release what doesn't value you, you make room for what truly will. There's a powerful shift that happens when you stop reacting emotionally to someone's inconsistency. When you no longer match their silence with anxiety or their detachment with overcompensation, something in the dynamic starts to recalibrate. It's not about playing games. It's about energy. Every relationship is, at its core, an exchange of emotional energy. And when one person pulls back, the other often rushes in to fill the gap. That reaction comes from fear. The fear of loss, rejection, or being forgotten. But the truth is, every time you rush in to close that emotional distance, you teach the other person that they can drift away without consequence. When you stop doing that, when you stop chasing, explaining, or proving your worth, you interrupt the pattern. You create space for balance to return. Because attraction, real attraction, lives in that space between comfort and curiosity. When everything about you is predictable, your reactions, your availability, your forgiveness, you take away the natural tension that keeps connection alive. The more someone can predict your behavior, the less they feel the need to earn your attention. But when you become less reactive and more composed, You introduce mystery again, not the manipulative kind, but the kind that comes from emotional maturity. You see, emotional control is not about withholding affection or pretending not to care. It's about choosing peace over panic. It's about saying, seat, if I trust that, what's meant for me will stay, and what's not will drift away, and I won't chase either. That mindset changes everything. It radiates calm, self-assurance, and power. The kind of power that doesn't come from dominance, but from groundedness. And people feel that. They feel it in the pauses, in your silence, in the way you don't rush to fix what they broke. Most people are drawn not to the loudest emotions, but to the quietest confidence. When you don't chase, you create emotional contrast. They start to notice that your world doesn't revolve around them anymore. They feel the distance they once created. And this time, it's not comfortable. Because before, your reaction filled the silence. Now, your silence makes them confront themselves. And that is far more powerful than any argument or explanation could ever be. The moment you stop emotionally reacting, you reclaim the upper hand, not in a manipulative sense, but in a psychological one. You're no longer the person who can be easily swayed by inconsistency or affection that comes and goes. You become the one who decides what energy stays in your life and what doesn't. That kind of self-respect doesn't demand love. It attracts it. And here's the deeper truth. When you stop reacting, you begin responding. Reaction comes from emotion. Response comes from clarity. One is impulsive. The other is intentional. You move from fear to focus, from desperation to dignity. And that shift not only transforms how others see you, it transforms how you see yourself. So the next time someone pulls away, don't panic. Breathe. Let the silence speak. Because in that space, you'll find the truth. Not just about them, but about you. Seat. And when you can hold your ground without anger or need, you'll realize that the power was never in their distance. It was always in your response. When you stop caring in the way that comes from fear, when you stop clinging, chasing, or needing validation, you give a man something he didn't expect. Space to feel his own emotions. Most people misunderstand what that kind of detachment really means. They think it's coldness, indifference, or revenge. But true emotional detachment isn't about pretending you don't care. It's about reclaiming your emotional balance. It's saying, I still care, but I refuse to make your uncertainty my chaos. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, can completely rewire how someone experiences you. When a man realizes you're no longer hanging on his every move, something in his mind begins to recalibrate. Before, your energy was predictable. He knew that no matter what he did, how inconsistent, distracted, or complacent he became, you'd be there, waiting, hoping, reaching out. But when that stops, when you pull your energy inward instead of outward, it creates an unfamiliar silence. And in that silence, he begins to hear his own thoughts, his own emotions, his own regret. That's the moment most people miss. The power of absence. You see, presence speaks, but absence echoes. When you're no longer available in the same way, it forces him to confront the reality of what he's lost. Every human being is wired to notice when something they once had is no longer accessible. It's not even just emotional. It's biological. The human brain responds to loss and scarcity. When you were always there, he didn't have to think about losing you. But now, your distance becomes a mirror that reflects his own disconnection. And this isn't about manipulation. It's not about using silence as a tactic or pretending you're unbothered when you're deeply hurt. It's about embodying the kind of emotional independence that comes from knowing your worth isn't tied to someone else's attention. The truth is, When you stop caring in that desperate, approval-seeking way, you don't actually lose connection. You gain self-respect. And self-respect is magnetic. It doesn't scream. It doesn't chase. It quietly radiates confidence. What often surprises people is how powerful this quiet confidence feels. Because when you stop over-investing, you stop leaking energy. You stop analyzing texts, replaying conversations, or building stories around uncertainty. You return to yourself. You start pouring that same attention you once gave to someone else into your own life, your growth, your peace, your ambitions. And suddenly, that energy shift becomes undeniable. Men feel it. They may not understand it logically, but they sense it emotionally. They can feel when your happiness no longer depends on them. They can feel when your world keeps moving even if they pause. And ironically, that's when regret begins to grow, because he realizes that your detachment wasn't anger, it was evolution. You didn't walk away to punish him, you walked away to protect your peace. So, when you stop caring in that reactive, fear-driven way, it's not a loss of love. It's a gain of power. It's the moment you trade emotional chaos for inner stability. And here's the beautiful part, when you become that grounded, that self-assured, people either rise to meet your energy or quietly fall away. Either way, you win. Because the love that's meant for you will never require you to lose yourself to keep it. And that's the lesson hidden beneath the silence. When you stop trying to control what someone feels, you start controlling what you allow. And in that space, you don't just regain your peace, you remind yourself that you were the prize all along. One of the most powerful shifts in any relationship happens when you stop measuring your worth through someone else's behavior. Because the truth is, when you stop caring in that anxious, approval-seeking way, it's not just that he starts to notice your absence. It's that as if you begin to notice your own presence again. That's the deeper transformation. The moment you stop waiting for his texts, overanalyzing his tone, or replaying every small interaction for clues, something changes inside you. You stop trying to be chosen and start choosing yourself. And that energy doesn't just change your relationships. It changes your entire life. When a man feels you no longer orbit around him emotionally, it forces him to reevaluate what he's been taking for granted. Because men, like anyone else, often don't recognize emotional value until they feel its absence. Your consistency, your patience, your willingness to forgive. It all becomes invisible when freely given without boundaries. But when that energy gets redirected inward, it illuminates your strength. It says, I'm not angry. I'm just done explaining my worth to someone who's not listening. That quiet composure, that calm confidence can hit harder than any confrontation ever could. Psychologically, this creates what I call the mirror effect. Your detachment reflects his behavior back at him. When you no longer chase, he begins to experience what it feels like to not be prioritized. When you stop overextending yourself, he begins to understand how much you gave. Suddenly, the imbalance that was once comfortable for him becomes uncomfortable. He begins to question his actions or his inaction. That's not manipulation. That's consequence. The natural result of energy shifting back to where it belongs. But here's the part that requires real emotional maturity. You don't shift your energy just to get a reaction. You do it because your peace matters more than his potential. You stop chasing not to punish him, but to protect yourself from emotional depletion. You understand that caring doesn't mean tolerating disrespect. Loving doesn't mean abandoning your boundaries. And forgiveness doesn't mean repeating the same cycle with someone who refuses to grow. When you reach that point, something profound happens. You start living from a place of emotional abundance instead of emotional scarcity. You no longer crave his validation because you've reconnected with your own. You don't need to prove your worth. You embody it. And that presence, that stillness, that self, that possession, it's rare, it's magnetic. It's the kind of energy that makes people realize what they've lost, not because you demanded it, but because you simply equos became unavailable to be undervalued Thet. And that's when he starts regretting it. Not because you stopped caring, but because you cared from a place of self-respect. He sees that you're still kind, still compassionate, but no longer compromising your dignity for attention. That's the version of you that makes him question everything. Because deep down, he knows. He didn't lose you because you were unloving. He lost you because you finally learned to love yourself better. So when you stop chasing someone who's unsure, you stop living half a life. You stop waiting for potential to turn into reality. And you start walking in your power. The day you stop caring in fear is the day you start loving in strength. And that's the day he starts to realize what he could have had. If only he'd valued it when he had the chance. When you finally stop caring in that desperate, proving kind of way, something extraordinary happens. You stop operating from fear and you start living from truth. And that shift, those subtle changes everything. Because most people don't realize how much of their energy goes into trying to control how they're perceived. Trying to make someone see their value. Trying to keep a connection alive that isn't being reciprocated. But the moment you release that control, you reclaim the power you unknowingly gave away. This isn't about becoming cold or indifferent. It's about becoming a sixth self, assured. You begin to understand that peace is not found in getting someone to choose you. It's found in choosing yourself. When you let go of the attachment to how things should be, you start to see them for what they are. And in that clarity, you gain strength. You stop needing reassurance from someone whose actions have been inconsistent. And instead, you give yourself the reassurance that comes from living in alignment with your values. That's the kind of emotional intelligence that doesn't scream for attention. It commands respect. Here's the psychological truth. When you detach from needing someone to validate you, they feel it. Humans are wired to sense energy shifts, especially when it comes from someone who used to overgive. The absence of your emotional availability forces a confrontation with reality. They can no longer rely on your effort to fill the silence or smooth over the distance. They begin to feel the weight of their own choices. That's when regret creeps in. Not just because they lost you, but because they realized they never really valued the peace, stability, and love you brought until it was gone. And the irony is, by that point, you've already evolved past the need for their recognition. You're not sitting around waiting for regret to show up. You've moved on to rediscover yourself. You start noticing how much lighter life feels when it's not centered around someone else's approval. You become more present, more creative, more focused on the things that actually fulfill you. That's the real reward of detachment. It gives you back your emotional bandwidth. From a philosophical standpoint, it's about liberation. True strength isn't in holding on. It's in letting go without bitterness. It's the courage to say, I can love deeply and still walk away if it costs me my peace. That kind of love isn't weakness. It's mastery. It means you've transcended the ego's desire to possess and learn to love from a place of freedom, not fear. And in that freedom, you become magnetic. Not because you're trying to prove anything, but because you've become whole within yourself. That wholeness radiates calm confidence. The kind that makes people reflect on how they treated you. The kind that doesn't need closure seat because you've already found it within. So when the day comes that you truly stop caring, not from resentment, but from self-respect, you'll realize something profound. You were never waiting for his regret. You were waiting to meet yourself again. And when you do, that reunion will be far more beautiful, far more healing than any apology could ever be. Because that's the moment you stop living for who you lost and stop living for who you've become.